Welcome everybody to the Spring Staff and Faculty Forum. This is the last of the series, and we have a great guest speaker with us today. But before we get to the presentation, let me give a few reminders, especially for those who are joining us remotely. Welcome. You also, just like the folks here in the room, have the chance to participate in the forum by asking the speaker questions at the end of the presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, please send an email to ORSP. The email address is orsp@uwec.edu. So we will have somebody monitoring the email address and forward your questions to the speaker. So again, welcome everybody. Welcome to our great guest speaker today. Let me say a few words to introduce our speaker. So we have Dr. Ryan Weichelt.
Yep.
Sorry.
No problem.
I asked you before too. As the speaker today, he's a professor in the Department of Geography and Anthropology here on campus. He is the author of several articles and chapters focusing on the electoral geography of Wisconsin, redistricting, and second home ownership in Wisconsin's Northwoods, to name a few. Of note, he was also an editor and contributor to the 2020 Atlas of Elections and the 2016 Atlas of Elections. So thanks for coming, and thank you for being here with us.
No problem. All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming across campus on this very beautiful day outside. Nice and dreary, and it's a good time to give a talk about elections. So this is talk came out of my probably the luckiest sabbatical on earth, right? So my entire sabbatical year was 2020 to 21, so I had to miss all the COVID stuff. So a little catch up this particular year. But having that entire sabbatical allowed me, oh my goodness, so much time and opportunity to get a lot of work done. Much of my emphasis on that sabbatical was on two things: working on redistricting work, which I'm not going to talk about today. But the other side of this was working on putting together another atlas of elections. This is now the fourth one, I believe, that's been produced. I've co-edited the last two, and we're hoping to kind of push forward. So I just kind of want to talk about sort of that journey associated with what happened during sabbatical and all the research I was able to get done, and put it into perspective by looking at maps, because as geographers, we like to share our information spatially, and the best way we can do that, obviously, many times is maps. So hopefully you have lots of questions at the end. There should be plenty of time. If anyone is really interested, the new atlas is coming out. It was supposed to come out in March, and then it was April. Now it's May, so if anyone wants to order it, you can pre-order it on Roman and Littlefield, but I will certainly be giving one to the library once I get a copy, and so you can check it out from the library as well. So I make my big money for royalties, right? It's about 10 cents, so. All right, so this is just some of the work I had contributed into the sabbatical work. So I'm putting these up here because I'm going to be drawing from maps from all the different work that was done over that particular year. Obviously, the biggest work had to come into putting the atlas together, and you can see my fellow editors associated with that, which is a great group of people from across the United States, from older to younger. My two PhD advisors, or my PhD advisor, my master advisor is on there, so it's a great work to work with them. I was fortunate enough to get moved up to one of the co-cartography editors, so that added a little bit of more work associated with it, trying to collect the data and make the maps for the various chapters. I also edited a few chapters, authored a few entries, and just want to point out, thanks through work through ORSP over the years, I was able to connect two students in this particular atlas that wrote entries as well. So undergraduates had published in this atlas, so it was great because I worked with them. It opened up that opportunity to do that. Some of the other work I was working on, a book chapter regarding Wisconsin and Trump and Biden in the 2020 election. I worked with my former colleagues from graduate school. We did an article about the situation in Kenosha, centering on the Jacob Blake situation. So that was one of those things. You'll see some of the maps associated with that. We also wrote another article, book chapter, that was focusing on various aspects of the pandemic as it related leading up to the election, as well as the effects of COVID-19 on the 2020 election as it relates to the presidential election. And then finally, I was able to kind of more fun put an article together about the misinformation about geography voting machines in the state of Wisconsin. So you'll see a map at the end. That was more a fun thing to do than just sort of put it around. So this work was just some of the work I was able to accomplish during the sabbatical. So I have to say thank you to ORSP for giving you that time to have that sabbatical, because that ain't possible when you're teaching all the time. So it was a good opportunity. So where are we coming from? You might be wondering, as you know, my fellow geographers, I think Paul and Ezra could probably do this talk for me, because I'm constantly bothering them about what I learn about the election. But needless to say, geography is different than political science, obviously, and other ways that we study elections. But it doesn't mean it's not less important. It kind of gets pushed off the side because geographers are cursed with, what are you going to do with geography? Well, we look at things spatially. So when we study elections, and electoral geography is a very small subset of political geography, we're really interested in how people are voting and the group behavior aggregated at certain levels, right? So we can look at the state level, or we look at the county level. I like looking at voting district level. And we try to understand groups of people and their voting actions by then analyzing those particular results. That doesn't mean we ignore surveys and put that stuff together, but our goal is looking at what are the patterns of elections on the landscape to further understand that. And so, you know, there's some downfalls of that. It's kind of, we're really based on election returns, and it has to be historical, because if you try to predict, it can work sometimes, and sometimes you predict it doesn't work very well at all. And that's been more difficult in the last few election cycles because of the volatility associated with things. And that's a little different than what political science and some social sciences will do. They tend to focus more on what we call individual behavior by focusing on surveys to try to understand groups of people and why they may be acting at the ballot box or politically in their particular stuff. So I focus more on the geography side, but I'm really trying to link these two together, and it's not easy. Any of you academics know how entrenched you get in your studies, and it's not been an easy go. I've had a lot better work working with European political scientists and geographers than political scientists in the United States. So we're getting there, we're trying to. So that's what we're kind of going into. So what's the story that I'm trying to kind of lead up to today? I'm going to show you a whole bunch of maps to sort of put this in perspective. It's somewhat temporal, but sometimes I got to kind of jump around. But I want to start out first by, you can't understand the 2020 election without understanding 2018, at least in Wisconsin. In my opinion. We have to look at what happened in 2018 in Wisconsin to try to understand what happened in the 2020 election in that sense. And the biggest thing is, the elephant in the room obviously is Trump, right? How are people going to react to Trump not being in the ballot in 2018, okay? The big question was, a lot of people turned out to vote in 2016. Were they going to turn out in 18 or not? Okay, so we have to see that. The other side of this, 2018 is a midterm. Midterms never work out well for the president. I'm not looking forward to 2020. This November is going to be brutal, I think. But you know, will the anti-Trump voters then turn out? You know, how mobilized were they in that sense? So we'll talk a little bit about that. I also want to talk some about the primaries, and specifically use Wisconsin as an example to talk about the primary leading up to the stuff that you saw leading up to 2020 and afterwards. And then obviously COVID-19 played a certain role in many of those things as well. Then I'll talk a little bit about race. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff happening in 2020 with Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Jacob Blake. That's just to name, sadly, a few of many other situations that occurred. We talk about Black Lives Matter, and then the issue, I don't really have much maps associated with defund police, but that sort of fit in there and really kind of hurt the Democrats a little bit in that sense. And then I'll talk a little about then the election itself, and then at the end, this sort of moving forward in this discussion of voter fraud and misinformation. And so that should sort of wrap everything up to go through that. So that's what we're going to be doing. And so let's start out first by looking at the 2018 election, the gubernatorial election in Wisconsin. Kind of interesting if you're not so familiar about Wisconsin. This is, the election pattern shouldn't be very you should know these patterns quite well. Dane County, Columbia County, Sauk County is kind of a nice Democratic area. Milwaukee County, obviously a huge Democratic area. You can see Menominee County, Native American vote, always Democratic. And then there's this always sort of strong Democratic support in the far Northwoods. Granted, there's not a whole lot of people that live up there, but needless to say, they have that various support. You also catch other Native American areas across the state and cities. So Tony Evers was able to sort of I'll have to admit I was surprised, right? That Tony Evers won that election against Scott Walker, who had been around for a long, long time. Many of us know how Scott Walker likes the universities a lot, right? No, I shouldn't make those political commentaries, but it was a surprising election. And the big thing came about was, Scott Walker was a popular person in the state of Wisconsin for many, many people. But we go back and start thinking, well, how did Evers do based on how Clinton performed? But also then the biggest issue was, what about Trump? Were these rural Trump voters that were extremely fired up? I mean, they were fired up in 2016. Were they going to turn out to the election box in 2018 when Scott Walker to them was whatever and Trump wasn't on the ballot? And the question that you see is, how did Evers pull this off? And you can see this map is somewhat misleading because it looks like Evers did really well in the rural areas. And so this map is showing the difference between Clinton and Evers, right? To see how it's going on with that. So if you see a positive percentages with these blues, right here, that means a place where Evers outperformed Hillary Clinton in 2016 at the percentage level, not the total vote level. But this map is somewhat misleading because it looks like Evers is cleaned up in the rural areas. Well, compared to Clinton he did, this tells us these Trump voters didn't turn out to vote. They weren't as interested. None of them didn't turn out to vote, but many of them didn't turn out to vote, and Evers was able to pull this election off by about 20,000. Trump won 2016 in Wisconsin by eating up, nibbling little votes here and there. He's like a little Pac-Man going across the state, and it was just enough to win by what? I think it was 18, 20,000 something in 2016. Well, these people sort of reversed in that particular sense. So Evers did really well in those relatively rural areas compared to what Walker was able to do. And this is a map showing then how Walker did compared to Donald Trump. And so the positive percentages, these darker ones up here, are areas where Walker outperformed Donald Trump at the percentage level. And you can see Walker did very well in this key area of Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington County, which is the traditional conservative part of Wisconsin. Trump didn't do very well there at all. But you can see Walker didn't do that great compared to Trump. He wasn't really able to inspire those rural voters to turn out to vote. So that was a key indicator of what's going to happen in 2020 is from this election coming forth thinking, okay, are these people going to turn out to vote now because Trump's back? We don't know, okay? Well, we do know, but at that point in 2018, we didn't know. We saw this election. It was pretty interesting stuff regarding that. So I think 2018 provided some of that interesting interplay of the impact Trump has on the ballot, right? The guy was just around for 2 years. He had that tremendous of an impact and was going to have that greater impact probably going into 2020 as well. All right, so as we're leading up, Trump gets impeached, and then he gets impeached again. Remember all that fun stuff? Well, and then something obviously came to our doorsteps. Right, COVID-19 entered the fray of this. This map comes from the article that we did about COVID-19 to talk about the impact. And what was really fascinating was the primary season was in play. Obviously, the Republican primary didn't matter. It was the Democratic primary. The primary season started in Iowa, I can't remember the exact date, early February, and then followed quick by New Hampshire. And then we kind of moved through a few states like South Carolina to get to Super Tuesday. And by about March 10th, I think, if we remember right. Remember, COVID really started taking over. The CDC or the World Health Organization identified something, and then everything sort of came to a grinding halt. I still remember the night we were playing tennis. Tennis ended, we went to get some food, and Rudy Gobert had got COVID, and the NBA shut down, and then everything after that was boom. I just remember click, 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 click. The question coming for that then was like, there were a whole lot of primaries that had to be done after that shutdown around May 18th or March 18th or so. And luckily for us in Wisconsin, we were the next in line. And so the discussion was related to that was, okay, how are we going to run an election during COVID? I'm not going to get into the details of all the court cases that got involved because it was pretty messy in that sense. But it was pretty clear how quickly COVID had become an important political aspect. If you remember that primary, the discussion was about absentee ballots. Could we mail ballots out? How could the workers be protected? You know, all that stuff sort of came into it. And Wisconsin provided that first real sense of COVID was going to be a political issue. And so this next map, there were some elections besides the primary. The primary, Joe Biden by this point was going to win everything. It was pretty much a done deal. Sanders just didn't have enough, and the rest of the candidates didn't. So I don't want to focus so much on the primary for Joe Biden, but there was an election for the judge, right? Jill Krafowski was going for the state Supreme Court. She was the liberal judge. I can't remember at this point. I have mind blank of who the guy he was running. The guy that was the incumbent that was appointed by Walker. Kelly. His name was Kelly. I forget his first name. But what this map is trying to illustrate is the really surprising victory that Krafowski sort of wiped the floor with that particular one. Everyone's like, holy man. It was pretty amazing that how easily she won. But what this map is showing just her percentages at the county level. But the big issue was then looking at absentee ballots and mail voting. This gave the Republicans, and specifically Donald Trump, the platform that he needed to even push further about misinformation, that absentee ballots lead to voter fraud. He had a quote at one point, I think I have it on the next thing. I'll wait to show you those quotes in just a second. But he used COVID-19 and voting to start this discussion about misinformation and the problems associated with that. And if you did run some statistics associated with it, in general, the rural counties that were less likely to adopt some of these COVID things and not return absentee ballots and rather do it in person tended to vote more Republican versus, I should say, liberal, or conservative versus liberal in that particular sense. So it really started setting up that phase of Wisconsin playing this role and say, okay, we can do an election during this, but COVID became that dividing line, and then absentee ballots, talking about voter fraud and all that stuff is really highlighted by Wisconsin, unfortunately. We seem to, I make the argument that over the last decade, no state has dictated politics in the United States than Wisconsin. We've dictated almost everything. I want to try to maybe turn that over to someone else. Getting a little tiresome in the stuff that's not working out in the way I think it should. But if we look at some of these things, Trump had this platform in two different ways about anti-COVID and voter fraud. He got on Fox News at one point and claimed, even before the election was going to happen in Wisconsin, because it was April 7th, I believe, was the primary, March 31st on Fox, he claimed that, okay, if we do all mail-in voting, that it would be leading to levels of voting that if you agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected again in this country. So the belief that mail voting is going to, fraud is rampant with mail voting. People are cheating left and right attached to it. It gave him that platform, and Wisconsin was the first test for that. Even though many states had moved in that particular direction, but try to get into his head, and that doesn't go very well. And I think that relates then using COVID as itself as a way of political thing. You might remember, I'm laughing because I still remember watching this when he talked about if we hit the body with tremendous, this is his exact quote. If you ever read Trump in his quotes, it's difficult to read, but whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or some other way, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute, and then there's a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning. And I remember, what's her name? Deborah Bricks is going, oh God, just going like this. It's fun to it's not fun to joke about, it's kind of fun to laugh about, but the reality of this was it became partisan. The Republican Party represented everything anti-COVID, while the Democratic Party had to sort of go the opposite direction. And it was going to be the defining moment of the 2020 election was this battle of COVID. And it started in Wisconsin in terms of the mailing stuff and the fights that would then lead to it. The Supreme Court backing a different view, the state legislature not wanting to do anything about COVID and letting the localities do some of that stuff. And you could see the complete Democratic versus Republican states fixation on that. Some other interesting aspect was this was some information that we gleaned in terms of using cell phone data that one of my co-authors was trying to look at places where people were staying home versus not staying home. And you can kind of see it, and there's some interesting differences that were going on. But the more mobile places generally tended to be more Republican places versus the more places that stayed at home. Again, each state had different rules at this particular time, so you got to take it with a grain of salt. But that movement relates to people's perceptions of COVID. And the biggest spikes that happened during the summer started in Arizona, right? And then transitioned into Texas and Florida, and then eventually got up into Wisconsin, which I believe really hurt Trump, was because our spike was right during the election, and the eastern side of the state was just hammered. And that was a place that Biden did pretty well compared to Trump. Anyway, so there's that aspect. You can kind of see the reactions associated with how people were traveling, or I should say the difference between Trump and Biden and perceptions of actually campaigning. Trump didn't care. This is the Biden one. You can see how Biden really, they made fun of him, right? He was in his basement all the time because he didn't want to come out and face the public. Well, his belief was we didn't need to put 20,000 people in an arena when this virus is out of control. And so you could see his travel schedule wasn't that much. There's only 18 places in the last week that he did campaigning when he finally came out of his basement. And you can see they're all battleground states. Versus if we look at Trump, he was at 27. He just didn't care. He was going to go to places. Well, ironically, it caught up to him, right? Apparently, they think he maybe got that COVID either right before the Minnesota rally or at the Minnesota rally, and then you remember him going into the hospital in that sense. But you can kind of see that mindset of campaigning, in a normal election, this map would even be bigger, and Biden's would be bigger, where the campaigns would be constantly going places. COVID shut a lot of that stuff down, and people latched onto it as either, hey, Trump doesn't care, he's like us, I want to be free, I'm tired of wearing masks, I'm tired of doing all this other stuff, where Biden was taking a more cautious approach. And again, just illustrating that stuff. This is just sort of jumping ahead a little bit, where this shows the cumulative number of cases per 100,000 people between January and January for the year. You can see the areas that in more red-ish had more higher cases of COVID compared to the other places were lower during that particular time period. And one of my colleagues, which actually was my stats professor back in the day, ran his regression stuff. And besides the high correlation, the dependent variable being that cumulative cases of COVID strongly correlated the most to minority populations, and we know the realities associated with healthcare in that particular sense. But the second one was then percent Republican vote. So places that had higher rates of COVID and in the community tended to vote Republican, and it relates to some of those particular things. So this is some of this article is sort of focusing on those particular aspects. So that's COVID, right? Other things were going on. Obviously, the unfortunate reality of Breonna Taylor being murdered in Louisville, and then George Floyd. And race became a secondary aspect associated with the election. And this was incredible data that an individual from Arizona collected every March across the world, actually, and had the city. And so I contacted him. He's like, yeah, here, it's free. And so I geocoded it and mapped. These are all protests during the June of 2020 related to George Floyd. Sadly, sometimes it takes some of those situations to bring it to the forefront a bit more. But you can see the entire country reacting in some sort of level, and even into some rural places that you may not have seen. So the point I'm getting at here is that race became an important issue during the election, as well as police aspects. And so I just think it's fascinating to see all these different protests that were happening across the United States, even in the parts of Alaska, right, in that area. We can turn our attention then real quick as we're going through Kenosha and Jacob Blake. If you remember, was pulled over by his ex-girlfriend, called saying something. He was in his car. He got out of his car. Then he went back to his car. They said he had a knife, and they shot him in the back. Right? And that led to some pretty interesting issues. And in southern Wisconsin, the issue of race in Kenosha, this is illustrating a couple things. It's showing the percent black population in Kenosha, so the downtown area, as well as where Jacob Blake was shot, and then Kyle Rittenhouse doing his shooting during the protests, all happening in this downtown area. And the question was going to come, what does this going to sort of mean? A lot of this starting from George Floyd and people getting upset about rioting and the destruction of property. You know, question of who were the people destroying the property, that's a whole other paper in its own self. But many people, voters, specifically suburban voters, and even people living in some of these areas didn't like to see the violence associated with the protesting. And so what this map is showing is a more zoomed in detail of Kenosha and all the buildings that were destroyed or damaged during the protests that lasted a couple nights. And you can see where Kyle Rittenhouse shot and killed the 2 different individuals, and they shot a third one that survived in that particular place. So kind of playing off in that sense. I'll show you later what the election results were, though, and Trump really jumped on this pretty quickly, and the defunding police thing that was sort of happening across the United States really hurt the Democratic Party, because they didn't really have a good response to that. When you say defund police, those that understood it know maybe what they're getting at, but if you're a general person that says don't fund the police, that did not go very well. And this is a prime example where Trump was down there pretty quickly, getting involved and changing people's mindsets about violence and police activities and race and those particular things. All right. Gotta move right along. I guess a few more maps. I want to open up for questions people have. We get to the election, and the election didn't end, and it didn't end, and it didn't end. It took a while, but we know by Friday or Saturday after the election that we know Biden had won, right? I mean, pretty much knew Biden had won a couple days afterwards. We just had to wait for Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin to put their stuff in. So Biden had surprised. They had flipped a few states. Georgia was a surprise. Many people thought it could happen, and it did. It flipped from Trump in 2016 to Biden. Obviously, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin flipped. And then the other big one was Arizona. And so you can see the electoral victory attached to that. Oops, Nevada should be colored blue there. Oh well. This is a map I didn't make, so I should be careful with that. That was something, this is John Heppen, I'm gonna talk to him, so. Okay. But what's interesting about this election is thinking about then, as a geographer, you know, we're looking at these different spatial units and thinking about why the patterns are occurring that they are. What we see, what this map is trying to illustrate, this comes from the Atlas, showing the increase in Democratic vote from 2016 to 2020, and then the decrease in Democratic vote as the red. Okay, so you can see in many places across, specifically the western part of the United States, surprisingly. Now, did Utah go to Joe Biden? No, but we see that erosion and the frustration some people were having with Donald Trump. And we can kind of see that playing out through much of the United States, and in some places strengthening in strong Democratic areas like Colorado. Some people maybe thought Colorado didn't have Trump to have much of a chance, but it was pretty clear quickly that he wasn't going to come close to touching Colorado, and that's pretty much been solidified now as a Democratic state. We see the strength growing in New England, specifically New Hampshire, I think was a surprising result. But on the back end of this is where I did my dissertation work, focusing on Hispanic voting patterns. This one was surprising, right? This area was die-hard Republican or Democrat for years. I remember when I was in grad school, a long time ago, I dated a lady from McAllen, Texas, and we're going to her friend's house, and they had a picture of Bill Clinton because her mom they loved Bill Clinton, and it was right next to the Pope. They were right, and she was so proud because Bill Clinton signed that picture, right? So it's very interesting to see this erosion that had taken place. Now, did it vote Democratic as a whole? Yes, but a lot of vote was lost, and there's this big question moving forward, what's going to happen to Hispanic vote, specifically in Texas. There was a poll that just came out in Nevada that the current senator, who herself is Latina, is actually losing in the polls to a Republican, and it's only by 3 points, and everyone's like, this is not good. And a lot of it was erosion of the Hispanic vote for Democrats towards Republicans. So that's just something to kind of keep your eye on attached to it. But again, more or less, the country went more towards Joe Biden, and you can make the argument a lot of it was anti-Trump. Some of it was more people turned out to vote in 2020 than 2016. A lot of people didn't like Hillary Clinton for various reasons. what this map is trying to show is, we talk about persistence. If the dark blue meant that it voted Democrat in 2016, and in 2020 it voted Democratic, the dark red, Republican, Republican. If you see a light blue, right, you see some of these counties, these light blue counties, those were Republican 2016 and transitioning to Democratic in 2020, versus the light pinks were Democratic that switched to Republican. There's not a whole lot, right, of either one of those things, but we can kind of count them up and sort of figure out what's going across the entire country in that sense. So just an interesting way of thinking about persistence and change, and looking at states as geographers and asking the questions of why. Why did those things occur in those particular ways? All right, in the last couple seconds here, we look at Wisconsin. We think about, how did Joe Biden win Wisconsin? Was it Joe Biden or was it just anti-Trump? A little combination of both. This is the election. We see the change where Biden outperformed Clinton in the biggest areas. As much as people in Madison will love to say, yes, they won the election for us. You got it, Dane County. Don't tell people that. They came out like gangbusters. Holy man, did they turn out. But we see this slow erosion taking place in Waukesha County, and even in Ozaukee County, and then the erosion that we're slowly starting to see in the Fox River Valley. So that's the type of stuff, this next map would illustrate this difference between Trump in 2020 and 2016. If I'm a Republican in the state of Wisconsin, this scares the crap out of me, and that scares the crap out of me. That's the elections in Wisconsin are here, 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 and here, and maybe you can pick up some stuff from the rest of the areas. The question moving forward is, can enough rural vote turn out to overtake these gains that we've seen? Are these people going to stay home? Are they not? But these erosions that we're seeing in some of the suburban areas, and then specifically the Fox River Valley, is not a good indicator for Republicans in the state at the statewide level. At the local level, that's redistricting, and that's for another talk. All right. So kind of to end with this interesting aspect is looking again back at Kenosha, what happened here, the opposite of maybe what you thought happened. The places that were impacted by the protests that were largely black voting actually saw some of the greater support for Donald Trump. His rhetoric and fear of violence and talking about all that stuff actually influenced voting in this. It still voted Democratic, but the most amount of decreases of Democratic support actually were occurring in those central areas that saw the violence and talked about those issues with that, and actually sort of strongly resonated with many of those voters in those areas. And surprisingly, the suburban areas didn't change too much in the surrounding areas in that particular sense. All right. Lastly, I'd just like to point this out. This drove me nuts because I've been mapping voting machines because it's stuff I do. I don't know why, I just do. But needless to say, Tom Tussler, who's the assembly chair of the elections committee, had talked about Dominion voting machines, right? And these evil Dominion voting machines. If you remember Wisconsin, there was a recount in Wisconsin because Trump said that things were bad here, the fraud. And he only could afford to do it in Dane County and Milwaukee County. And people were like, yeah, because it's Dominion voting. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's not even use Dominion voting, right? They use a different company. And honestly, the more Republican counties across the state of Wisconsin are the ones that use Dominion voting. So it was just one of those interesting ways of how do you debunk some of this stuff? Well, a quick map like that can really expedite things pretty quickly. So it's the power of geography to kind of quickly erase away misinformation. And then finally, we know what happened on January 6th and 7th. This is just another part of the atlas I just want to point out, is talking about the vote to certify the elections and the horrific actions that took place in that particular spot. So we're seeing those that actually supported it now are all pretty much quitting, except Liz Cheney's the only one I think staying and might lose her seat, surprisingly. If you would have asked me 15 years ago if Cheney is the target of a Republican, I'd look at you and say you're crazy, but very interesting world we live in. So what are our conclusions? Geography helps put these spatial perspectives together, specifically in local context of things. I mean, geography, in my opinion, because I'm very biased, is an extremely powerful tool in the study of elections. But unfortunately, it's very misunderstood and easily dismissed by other social scientists. And specifically, political science has been the one that's dismissed it the most. And so my hope today is to show how this presentation shows how flexible spatial studies are and how they can be effectively used to study politics. So that's it. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Do you have an example of how political science didn't go along with geography?
Oh, yes, I can give you the quiet example. If there's any political scientists out there, the first thing they'll throw at you is something called ecological fallacy. And their argument is saying that we're aggregating things at different levels and jumping to conclusions because Eau Claire County votes Democratic, therefore everyone votes Democratic in Eau Claire County. So their argument based upon that is quite typically when you're mapping stuff, that's the one thing that they don't like spatial studies, which is ironic because surveys do the same thing, but that's a whole nother situation. So political science in the United States just does not embrace mapping for whatever reason, and I try to get to the root of it. I don't know what it really is, but Europe is much more amenable to these types of things, so it is. So trying to break those silos down, but it's not easy. Yeah?
Have you done any spatial analysis on how misinformation spreads, like where it originates, the patterns that it spreads to, that kind of stuff?
That I have not, but I know there's some younger folks that are all attuned to that, like my colleague over here can web scrape and look at the impact of Twitter and those particular types of things. I know we tried to get some people, there's a discussion about some of that in the Atlas, but that's not my personal area. But I know anecdotally for dealing with Wisconsin and getting on, I do this on purpose and I shouldn't because it makes me not feel good about myself, but you get on Facebook and join the Facebook groups of particular elected officials in the state of Wisconsin, and you can see how quickly that misinformation is spread, and it's done intentionally, just on Facebook. And that's just one area. If we think about Twitter and I don't know, all the other ones that are out there too. So that's an up-and-coming thing. I know people are looking into it, but I personally haven't done that.
Would you recommend a place to look at?
For citations?
If I'm interested in learning more.
I at the top of my head, I cannot. Other questions or comments or thoughts?
I guess
Yeah.
one other question was the process, you've worked on the Atlas for a number of
Mhm.
iterations. Has the process of creating the Atlas changed over time?
Yeah, it actually, that's a really good question. In the time of COVID, this atlas was so much easier to put together because we actually met every week or every 2 weeks on Zoom. Because before we'd have to wait to see each other at conferences. And since we met every week or so, every 2 weeks, we were able to kind of flush things out a lot easier. And so the process was a heck of a lot easier this go around. And I think the other thing that helped too was there were 2 people doing cartography, and I was added a third. That made things go a lot quicker in that sense. So yeah, that's a really interesting question you brought up. It made it a lot easier to do it because of Zoom. The biggest issue that we have though is moving forward, which is kind of sad, is many of these editors they've retired and they just don't want to do it anymore. And there's not a whole lot of electoral geographers left anymore because all the electoral geographer PhD programs are where these guys were, and they're retiring and they're not replacing them. And so electoral geography's future is those of us that are younger. I have a friend at River Falls, there's me, we don't have graduate students. And there's another guy, Bob Wittrell, he does have master's students, but we don't have any electoral geography actually happening at the PhD level hardcore anymore compared to it. So the future of the Atlas is up in the air. We're going to get 2024 after that. I don't know what's going to happen. So
No more elections after.
no, there very might not be after 2024. We could be done with elections, right? If you've seen some of the stuff that's going on in like Hungary and El Salvador, you'd understand. So
if there's, just to see if there's any question from the remote viewers.
We're good.
We're good, okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. Of course, thank you to our speaker.
Mhm.
This is, as I said, the last of the presentation in the series for the spring semester. So join us again in fall. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you.